Hi, folks. This is another go-to training session for Digital Cinematography 1, DFM 202. This evening, I'd like to address some changes that are going to happen on the LAO. For those of you that are into week 2, week 3 work by now, I congratulate you because that means you're staying ahead of it and you're submitting on time, which is very good. However, last week we did have a number of poor performances on the Project 1 assignment entitled The Exposure Game. So I wanted to bring you guys up to speed on what's going on with that. Now, this has come after a considerable amount of thought on my part and some discussion with colleagues and some discussion with some of you in regard to the structure of the assignment, the level of difficulty, and the degree or lack thereof of clarity in what's expected. So I've got a number of assignments here that I have graded, and the results were not real good. And it's my firm belief that after careful consideration of the exercise as a whole, I have determined that it's a bit too complex for a level 1 cinema class, and therefore I've taken it upon myself to redesign the class with a simpler objective in mind. Some of you may know that we, as your instructors, design a fair number of these courses for you. I have been responsible for designing Lighting 2, Cinematography 2. I have also been involved with updating Lighting 1 and now Cinematography 1. And what I would like to do is reintroduce a new week 1 project. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time now constructing a new worksheet, which I have emailed to a number of you already this evening, along with an invite to the go-to training session for tutorial on this new form of the exercise. I think we'll still call it the exposure game. It's kind of a neat title, and I think that it is now more reminiscent of a game than it was before for many of you, unfortunately. And I do apologize for that. It's I've always felt that perhaps that assignment was a little overcomplicated or too complex, and therefore we have a solution for you this evening that I hope you will receive in goodwill and give it a shot. What I will do for you, if you have taken the existing week 1 exposure game assignment and you have worked the parameters and submitted a project that you have not scored well on, I think then I'm about to extend to you a little bit of a windfall, because I have a new document that you will be allowed to take a whack at and see how you do. I'm going to go over it with you this evening, talk to you about what the objectives are and how to work the worksheet, how to plug the numbers in. And the good news is you don't have to shoot anything for this assignment. There's a little bit of math involved, but I don't think it's the kind of math that you're going to need a calculator for, because it's fairly simple and it's all base 10 numerical values, so they're fairly easy to exchange mentally or with some scratch paper. and a pencil. And so, and I'm going to give to you some handy little graphs that are going to help you achieve the what I hope are correct answers for the worksheet. And then I'm going to ask you 5 questions at the end, and you just fill in your answers in the boxes provided. So let me switch over from my camera to the LAO really quick and show you. This is the current state of Project 1.3, the exposure game. And so you've got the overview, and it's telling you that you got to shoot some clips, and you're going to have to plug some frame grabs into the worksheet and balance your exposures and take pictures of your monitor and submit all of that while explaining what the effects of changing the variables was. And then here's all your PDFs and your pages downloads. And you can basically nix all of this, particularly if you have already done the assignment and scored poorly, because you no longer have to go through all of that. So what I want to do now is I want to bring up a copy of the new PDF, and I want to scroll through it with you. In fact, I have the pages document here that I worked on today, and I can show you with that. So here we go. Here is the new document, and the instructions have been consolidated and simplified to simply state that you are to examine the baseline exposure, which is here at the top of the page. And basically, you're going to work all the highlighted boxes, all these boxes that are cast in gray, that are filled in here. These become your X variables, or your unsolved exposure variables. So you can see that some of the values have been plugged into the chart already. All of the shutter speeds in the first 9 questions or problems are the standard 1/48th of a second, which would coincide with your standard 144-degree shutter. You'll notice that a variety of these are 24 frames, but we have varied the frames per second a little bit in particular examples. We've started with a base ISO of 800, and we are moving towards something upwards of 3200. Now, previously on the assignment, you were asked to limit your camera to ISO 1000 on your low gain, 2000 on your mid gain, and 3200 on your high gain. But this assignment functions independently of your FS5. Now, what do I mean by that? Some of you have been made aware of the FS5 firmware update. If you don't know about it, you can go to the Sony website and check on their firmware updates for all their cameras. Go to the section for the FS5, and you can find the most recent software version for the Sony FS5 camera, and you go into your camera menu in your About section, and you find out which firmware update you have in your camera. And if it's not the most recent one, you can download their firmware update with an SD card, and then you can load that into the camera and download it into the camera, and any of the features that have been updated or upgraded by Sony will instantly become a part of your new functioning protocol of that camera. So the most recent update included an 800 ISO minimum gain rating, and so some of you may have that already installed in your camera, and if so, terrific. If not, that's okay, because again, this assignment is independent of the specs of the Sony FS5. In fact, what I want to discuss with you next are the baseline or standard increments in which we calculate our exposure combinations and solutions on set. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the variations are and what these numbers represent. And so I'm going to move on to the second page of the document, which has some interesting graphs for you. Now, there's a lot of graphs out there on the internet, and these have been pulled down for you because of their simple but direct concepts. There's a lot of stuff out there that looks more complicated than it needs to be. There's a lot of stuff out there that is relevant for still photographers, but not really for cinematographers, which is what you folks are. So I've selected some stuff that is relevant to our concerns, and then I've put it in this little page 2 worksheet helper for you, so you can use these to make your calculations. So the first little graph that we have here is your ISO measurement of sensitivity. And this covers a lot more numbers than you're going to notice that you have in your camera. And that's okay, because ISOs, all they are sensitivity values that have been standardized by a global standards board called the International Standards Organization. They are in Europe. I think they reside in Germany, but I'm not sure. And basically what they've done is they have decided, they've created a bunch of standards for sensitivity as it applies to capture devices like LCDs, CMOS chips, sensors that we have in our video cameras and in our pocket cameras and in our telephones, for that matter. And basically what they're doing is what they've done is, over the years, they've created a number of different scales for us, for photography and for film. And the ISOs in the past have gone all the way down to 8 ISO, with the caveat that when you shoot that kind of film, and this particular film was manufactured by Kodak. Kodak indicated in the packaging that while they had a firm belief that the film was reliably ISO 8, their recommendation was that you do ample exposure testing with that film before you shot anything critical or for a client where you needed to rely on the concrete nature of that value, ISO 8. So ISO 8 being the lowest ISO that I've been aware of in recent years, all the way up through film stocks that made it all the way to 3200 ISO. And now in the digital age, we've gone far beyond 3200 ISO. In fact, it's fairly standard now that most digital cameras will capably achieve ISO 12600 at a minimum, and oftentimes 25,000 plus in their sensitivity. And cameras like the Sony A7S II, the little compact DSLR, is quite legendary because it has a sensitivity that is measured in ISO 430,000. So that's some pretty far out variety of ISO variables that we can mess around with. Some cameras are really very sensitive. It has to do with how many pixel sites are on your capture device, what the standard file render is from that particular capture device, how many megabytes is the base file that the camera is creating, how much resolution does the camera generate. But the ISO in particular is a direct function of voltage to the chip and pixel sites. So every pixel site is basically a combination of red, blue, and green sensitive um, photovoltaic sites that when they are charged with current become uh, um, sensitive on a sliding scale. So the more voltage that's applied to the capture device within the tolerances of heat and current capacity, the more current you apply to the pixel site, in essence, the more sensitive it becomes. So um, ISO is now, rather than considering silver grains and how they are exposed to light and converted to salts that are then washed with acidic developer and converted um, into halide crystals. Now we're talking about RGB pixel sites, voltage, and resolution. And so the ISO is taking all those factors into consideration when you determine or assign a sensitivity to your camera. So you could have a value now. Let's go back to our little chart. You could have a value now pretty much 100. Occasionally I've seen a 50 ISO on a couple of cameras, but pretty much the bottom ISO now, or the lowest ISO rating, which requires the most amount of light to hit the sensor to record a well-balanced image. You can start at 100 ISO, and you can go all the way in this chart to 3200 ISO, and I think that that's a good standard range. Yes, I know that some cameras can go higher than that, but there's a phenomenon that occurs a lot like grain in film in days of old, and that is the higher you rate the camera in terms of its ISO, in other words, the more you tell it to direct current to the chip, what it's doing is it has to sort of logarithmically select where the image is going to record based on how much reaction is happening at the pixel site. And sometimes if there's not enough photovoltaic reaction, the pixel site won't register as having recorded anything, and you'll get these black areas we call and associate with noise in our digital files, and it looks a lot like film grain from days of old. And basically film grain functioned the same way. If you had silver oxide grains that were stuck on the emulsion, and as you raised the ISO of the camera, you weren't really changing how much light was coming through the lens, but what you were doing, in essence, by raising the ISO, you're telling the camera that the recording medium that's inside is more and more sensitive. And if it's more and more sensitive, it's going to have effects on your exposure. So if you raise your ISO from 100 to 400, let's say, you have now made that sensor essentially, and this is merely an assigned value, you've essentially said that the camera is now 4 times more sensitive than it was a minute ago at ISO 100. But really all you've done is reassigned a value so that the exposure calculation processor inside the camera can reassign f-stop values for you and let you know if you're over or under exposure based on your new ISO rating. So like everything else in cinematography and photography, all of these values are values that you determine and you assign to your equipment and to your recording medium. And then, given that it's within the medium's tolerance to provide you an image, it will give you an image based on the way you have handled your exposures and the way you've assigned your values. So the higher the ISO, you're telling the camera the more sensitive it is. Well, if the camera is more sensitive to light, then the assumption would be that it doesn't need as much light to create an image, meaning that you could use faster shutter speeds or smaller apertures, or if you wanted to use, if the meters, your meter, whether your handheld meter or your camera's meter were telling you, say based on ISO 400, that The f-stop that you just read off your key light, coincidentally, I have a 4. That's at 800 ISO, though. If I turn the ISO on this down to, say, 400, you're going to see that when I tell the meter that my key light hasn't changed, but my camera is now ISO 400 sensitivity, now it's telling me that my exposure, I don't know if you can see, is a 2.8. Okay, so I went from a 4 at ISO 800 to a 2.8 at ISO 400. A 4 at ISO 800 and a 2.8 at ISO 400. So basically, when I went from 800 ISO to 400 ISO, what did I do? I cut the ISO value basically in half. And so I allowed half as much light to enter the camera at ISO 800 than I did at ISO 400. And as a result, because more light came through the lens at ISO 400, because it's a lower number, and a lower number assumes that it requires more light, the meter said I have to open up to 2.8, a bigger f-stop, than I had been at ISO 400. So if you stay at your smaller f-stops and your higher ISOs, you're not letting as much light hit your capture device or your film stock. And so grain, what was happening with grain is if you reduce the amount of light entering through the lens and striking the film stock, well, that means that presumably half as many silver oxide grains were getting struck by light, and the only way to convert them to silver salts that then adhere to the emulsion is for them to be exposed to light. So if they're not exposed to light, the minute you soak that film stock in the developer, anything that was not exposed does not convert to the little black tar basically that sticks to the emulsion, and it washes away. And where those silver grains have washed away create little gaps in the emulsion, okay? But it's a negative, so when you print it, the opposite will happen, and instead of it being, little gaps in your silver grains, it looks like little clumps of black all over your image because it's the reverse. It's a negative, so when you print it, the reverse of the image comes out on the paper, which we look at as a positive. And you see the little black specks that look like graininess or grit or sand. And that's from where the silver particles washed away because they didn't get exposed to light. Well, the same thing is happening with your chip. If it's not getting enough exposure, particularly in the blacks, like in values like down here in this image of my office, you might see the image kind of moving around on your monitor. I can see some digital noise right in here where there's enough exposure happening to where I can see some detail, but there's a lot of color noise happening in here, and you can see that in the image. It's kind of crawling around. That's noise, okay, and that's because there's not enough exposure in that particular area right there, okay. So back to the worksheet. What we're doing is we're starting with a base exposure, and we're going to plug in some values. So your base exposure is up here at the top, and we call it baseline, and we've plugged in a set of values. And what you can do is you can assume that that those values were played a role in creating a normal 18% exposure of something. It doesn't matter what it is. It's hypothetical, okay? All we're saying is on the baseline exposure, the values that we've plugged into the chart represented a correct, well-balanced 18% gray image of something. And you can put that image in your mind if you want. It doesn't really matter what it is. It could be a bowl of fruit on a table. It could be a woman sitting under a tree reading a book. It could be a picture of your dog, whatever it is. Basically, we've given you a baseline exposure, and you're going to plug in different values in the shaded boxes where we have left information blank, and you're going to do it in such a way that the values you plug in conjunction with the changed values in each one of the exercises will balance the same way that your baseline exposure did. And there's an example up there. Okay, so what you'll do is you'll come to your second page and you'll start considering these charts. So we talked about ISO already, okay? We call these, or I call these, jump charts, okay? Because what you're going to do is you're going to count the number of jumps that you take when you change a value in any one of these charts, really. It's really obvious in the neutral density chart, but I want to show you up here because it's a little bit bigger to read. If you change your ISO from 100 to 400, how many jumps is that? Count them with me. 1, 2, okay? You've gone from 100 to 400, and to do that, you jump from 100 to 200, and then from 200 to 400. And you should notice something that's happening when you do that. Basically, you're doubling your base value every time, right? I started at ISO 100, and then I jumped once to 200, which is double 100, and I jumped again to 400, which is twice 200. So basically, when you make a jump like that, you've jumped 2 stops. Now, if you started at ISO 100 with all the light that was necessary for an exposure at ISO 100, and then you cut down the amount of light by 50% and 50% again, you've doubled the ISO each time. All of a sudden, you go to 400 ISO, which is supposedly a higher sensitivity requiring less light, and that's basically what's happening. You're allowing less light to enter the lens at each of these ISO ratings. And you can jump again to 800, you can jump again to 1600, and you can jump again to 3200. Each time you make a jump, that represents an f-stop of change, okay? Now, if you look at page 1, you have several variables that you can change. Focal length has been nixed out in this chart because it doesn't have ostensibly anything to do with exposure, although it can, but I don't want to get into that with you. That's more of a cinematography 2 concept. Basically, we can change ND filters, we can change our f-stop, we can change our ISO, we can change our shutter, but for the first 9 exercises, it remains at 1/48th of a second, and we can change our frame rate. And we have different frame rates here for each of the 9 problems, okay? So basically, each line represents an exposure that will equal the baseline exposure, but it may have different combinations of variables that equal the baseline exposure. So for example, right, here's our example. The baseline was 116 ND filter. That's 1/16th the ISO for those of you who are a little bit more advanced. Or basically, do the jumps with me. You have settings on your ND on your camera, 1, 2, 3, and 0. Or sometimes you have quarter, eighth, 16th, and a 32nd. Okay, quarter ND is a 1-stop reduction of light coming through the lens. Eighth ND is 2 stops. 16th ND is 3 stops. And 32nd ND is 4 stops reduction of light coming through the lens. And when we look at the ND chart, you'll see that it's confirmed. Okay, so what we've done is our baseline includes the values 1/16th ND, an f-stop of a 4 on the lens, an ISO of 800, a shutter of 1/48th, and a frame rate of 24 frames per second. Now, 24 frames per second is our standard, right? 1/48th of a second is our standard. Many cameras, 800 ISO is also a standard, but in this case, 800 ISO at a 4 1/16th. Now our example has kept the same ND value, but the f-stop is different. Why is the f-stop different? Well, because the ISO went from 800 to 1600. Now, the shutter angle or speed has stayed the same, and the FPS, or the frames per second, has stayed the same. So this value changed, and it affected what these 2 shaded values were going to become. Now, we've chosen not to change the ND filter pack. That's fine. But in order to accommodate an ISO 1600 change, we made one jump from 800 to 1600. 1600 is twice 800. Check it out. Boom, one jump. That's one f-stop. So that means that this change in ISO from 800 to 1600 represented a reduction in exposure by one f-stop. Okay, because we went from a smaller ISO to a higher ISO. That means we let less light in. So that's a reduction in exposure of, boom, one jump, one f-stop. Well, if you reduce exposure coming into the camera by one stop and you started at a 4, what have you got to do to your aperture? Well, if we look at our aperture chart, we see, again, all of these f-stop values, and we see 1, 4, 2, 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. Now, in the old days, that's what you had on a still photo lens. Here's an Olympus 50 millimeter 1.4. That means the largest f-stop you can achieve in this lens is a 1.4. And I'll show you, if you look through it, at a 1.4, there's basically no blades of the aperture in the way of the light entering the lens. And as you close down, you'll see that the aperture or the diaphragm gets smaller, okay? Based on these numbers, okay? 1, 4, 2, 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, and this one bottoms out at a 16. That means the smallest f-stop that you can get in this looks like that, and it's a 16. Okay, it's a real small hole in the diaphragm as a result. Your cinema lenses are the same way. Your zoom lens or your kit lens works that way on your Sony, but it has no markings. Here's a Rokinon 100 millimeter Cine Prime, and you can see all the numbers on this lens. Some of them are focus values, and some of them are f-stop values. Here's my f-stop ring right here. And you can see this one closes down to 32, and it opens up to a 3.1. So this one doesn't have a 1.4, it doesn't have a 2, and it doesn't have a 2.8. It's got a 3.1, which isn't too far off. It's basically a third of a stop darker than a 2.8. So if we look at our chart, we'll show you what that means. So over here, here's my little Olympus lens from 1975 or 78, and it opened to a 1.4. Well, my Rokinon Cinema lens opens to a 3.1. Well, 3.1 is not listed on this chart. Why? Because these are the standard f-stops, okay? There are f-stops that exist in quarter or third stop increments in between the standards. But I don't want to talk to you about those right now, because those values are part of the reason why a lot of you had so much trouble with the old style worksheet. So what we want to talk about are the standard values, okay? And the standard values are 1, 4, 2, 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. Now these are all based on a formula, and the formula, folks, is really big and complicated, and I won't even pretend to tell you that I can remember it by heart what it is. I have to look it up every time. And the reality is, I don't need to calculate that by hand, because I got one of these, the light meter, and the light meter tells me the sensitivity of my light and gives me these values that I got to plug into the camera, okay? So we don't really need that formula anymore, but we do need to be aware of what the standard f-stop settings are. And part of the reason why is because we like to change things. And when we change things, we have to know what the jumps are so we can plug in the right values and change our exposure on our camera to make sure that we have dialed in the correct exposure on the video camera. Now, this was super critical in the days when we shot film. In the days when we had a 1,000-foot mag on the camera with a roll of film that's about as big around as a basketball and about 1.5 inches wide, 35 millimeter film stock. I loaded a lot of that in my time when I was your age. Okay, be lucky you guys don't have to do that anymore. When you got all that in the camera, it's a photochemical process to develop that film. So You don't really know until after that film's been developed and it's been inspected through a projector and looked at under the light to make sure the negative has proper density, it's not scratched, and it's not grainy. Okay, and the lab confirms all of that in what we call a scratch report every day before they send the film or they ship the film out by Delta Dash to wherever your production is shooting. And they send you what are called dailies. Now, in the old days, the dailies used to be actual printed film that came on a reel, and you had to project it and look at it to find out if your exposures were correct from the day before, or worse, from a couple days before. Okay? It was all up here until we saw it projected and confirmed that everything we did the day before was correct. Well, how'd you like to have that kind of weight of responsibility? Okay? I started my career in those days. I worked with the guys who suffered through that kind of process. And so I can tell you from our point of view, the old guard that did film, man, digital is a godsend because we no longer have to wait a day or more to have our instincts or our suspicions confirmed about what the correct exposure is with our tools. All we got to do is look at a monitor on the set, and we might have something as simple as a little onboard monitor on the camera. I got an Atomus back here on my Blackmagic 4K camera. And the image on the monitor is the image that is being piped to me from the capture device. And so if it's too dark, I just make an adjustment on the camera, either on the lens or the ISO, or I have the boys make my lights a little brighter or a little dimmer. We put scrims in, we dim things up and down, okay? And we correct our exposure because it's right there on the monitor. And I got to tell you, that helps me sleep at night. But anyway, so all of these variables, we have to change our exposures around because we like to change things. Maybe we want to shoot at a wider f-stop. Way down here on problem 3, you see that we've selected a f11 working stop, and we have kept the 1/48 and the 24 frames per second. So if 1/16 ND and a shooting stop of 4 at 800 ISO was a good exposure for your baseline, what happens when you change your aperture to an 11 and then you have 1/48 and 24 frames have stayed the same? Well, we're going to have a new ISO value and we're going to have a new ND value, and I guarantee you they're both going to be different than what you have here. So we go back to our charts and we start taking a look. All right, if we change from a 4 to a 5/6, how many jumps is that? One jump. One jump up, one jump down represents one stop over or one stop underexposed. One f-stop. If you jump all the way to 1/4, how many jumps is that from a 4? 1, 2, 3. That's 3 f-stop increase in the amount of light that has entered the lens because you have opened up the diaphragm to its widest aperture of a 1/4. And that's 1, 2, 3 jumps on the chart, okay? And the same goes the other way. If you go from a 4 to an 11, like we do in our example, how many jumps is that? 1, 2, 3. That means we have changed the amount of light entering the lens by 3 stops, and since we've gone from a smaller number to a larger number, that's a reduction in exposure. So we're now underexposed by 3 stops unless we do something to our ISO and our ND filters. Okay, we can't keep 1/16 ND dialed into the camera anymore because that represents how many jumps. Let's go to our chart. Let's look at ND. Here's your f-stop reduction right here. Okay, so if we start at 1/16 and we look over here, that's a 4-stop reduction in exposure. Why would we want to do that? Okay, let's say we like the way the background goes out of focus at a 2.8 when we shoot outside, and we do some nice close-ups like they did in Atonement, okay? And we're looking at the heroes at the fountain, and so we're looking at Gosh, what's her name? Our heroine, right? Keira Knightley, sorry. And we want the background to go out of focus. Well, we know the background will go out of focus at 2.8. That's depth of field. We're going to talk about that next week. But the meter says, you're at an 11 out here, son. Well, that's not going to work because at an 11, that's a small diaphragm. Check it out. Let's dial an 11 in on our 100 millimeter macro Rokinon and take a look at, whoa, look at that. That's a small diaphragm opening. Small diaphragm opening means the lens is squinting. When the lens is squinting, what happens? What happens when you squint? You're driving down the road and there's a street sign way far down the road. You can't quite read it, so you go, what does that say? You squint your eyes and all of a sudden it sharpens up and you know, oh, it says stop. Right? When you close the diaphragm down on your lens, the lens is squinting. When it squints, more things in the background become sharp and in focus. That's called depth of field. We'll talk about that later. Okay? So you don't want to shoot at an 11 outside. It's no good. The background's too sharp. We want to see Keira Knightley against some nice out-of-focus trees, not some sharp trees with details back there that are drawing our attention away from her beautiful makeup and her beautiful hair. We want to see this, and we want this to be out of focus. So we want to be at a 4. Well, let's look at our chart. All right, so if we want to be at an f4, and we have 1/16 ND dialed into the camera, that's 4 stops of reduction. We got to open up that filter pack or open up our lens. So we go to an 1/8, that's 3 stops. So we've already lost a stop. Go a jump. 1, 2, 3. Uh-oh, look at that. 3 jumps is 3 stops, and it's saying ND 1/2. Well, your camera doesn't have ND 1/2, it's got ND 1/4. So we could either go to nothing, which is clear, which is basically the same as ND 1/2. Okay? Or we could stay at a 1/4 ND. If we stay at a 1/4 ND, then we got to figure out what to do about our f-stop. So if this became a 1/4 ND at 11, we went 16 to 8 is 1, 8 to 4 is 2, right? That's 2 stops, but we got to make up how many? We got to make up 1, 2, 3. So we need another stop. So we can't be at ISO 800 here, but if we make another jump in ISO from 800 to what? If we want to gain more light, what do we got to do? We got to go to ISO 400 to gain light or 1600 to reduce light. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the answer is because if I do that, that's telling you how to fill in one of the problems on the chart, and that's your job. So you see what I'm doing? I'm counting my jumps. ISO 100 to 200 to 400 to 800. F14 to 2 to 28 to 4 to 56. ISO 800, 1600, 3200. ND, 1/4, 1/8, 16th, 32nd, or clear, right? Each time I jump, 1/4 to 1/8, 1 stop reduction in light. 1/8 to 16th, another stop reduction in light. 1/4 to 16th, 2 stops reduction in light, right? 16 to 0, though, is 3 stops, right? Take a look at the chart again. 16, this is 1, or essentially a filter factor of 1, okay? 1 times the ASA is what? The ASA, meaning no change, okay? So 1/4 or nothing. And if you look on your camera on the FS5, you got clear, 1/4, 1/8, 16, 32, right? Okay. So count your jumps, use the chart, fill in the gray areas based on the changes that you see line by line. Each line represents a well-balanced exposure that is as proper in balance as the baseline, but with different values plugged in. Okay, we've either changed the shutter speed, the frame rate, or the ISO, or the f-stop, or the ND pack. Okay, in bold figures are the changes. In gray boxes is where you have to fill this in. Now, this is 9 out of 12. The 3 remaining are a little bit higher difficulty level. And these are for the folks that are a little bit better at this, a little bit more advanced. We've changed our shutter angle, and you notice now shutter values for this section are posted in degrees. So you have to do a little bit of research. What does a 200-degree shutter represent? It's going to correspond to a shutter percentage like we have here, or ratio I should say, that corresponds basically to a frame rate. There's a shutter speed happening associated with a 200-degree opening. 144-degree opening, 180-degree opening. Now, to help you with that concept, I have given you a shutter angle chart to look at. All right, here's a 180-degree shutter, meaning at any moment when the charge to the chip is on, it goes on and off, right? It does that 60 times a second. It's either on or it's off. All right, when it's on, you have a shutter obscuring half of the frame, and it's allowing light to enter through the other side, and this thing spins around. That's the way it works in a film camera, and it's the way it works in a video camera with a global shutter. It's done electronically, but basically the effect is the same. If you change your shutter angle from 180 degrees to 90 degrees, what have you done? 180 minus 90 is 90. So you've cut it in half, and you've made this smaller. So what have you done? You've allowed half as much light to pass through. So the difference between a 180 degree and a 90 degree shutter is one stop. Now it looks like 2 jumps on this chart, but that's because these values are mixed up. This is 270 degree shutter, meaning it's open most of the way, and this is 45 degree, meaning it's closed most of the way. This is what we call skinny shutter, and this is the kind of shutter angle they'd use to film Omaha Beach and Saving Private Ryan, for instance, because this narrow opening of the shutter angle basically has the same effect as a fast shutter speed. And so it freezes action a lot better, but it has this blanking interval that's longer than normal because the shutter that's closed, the portion of the shutter that's closed, is blocking light from hitting the sensor. So you get a protracted period where the blanking interval between frames is longer, and so it makes the film appear like it's kind of stroby. Okay? You remember how on Omaha Beach, the guys are getting out of the boats and they're running up to the sand and they're kind of smeary looking, right? And everything is happening in a weird sort of suspended, protracted mode. Well, that was the skinny shutter effect that was happening. And they were doing that with film cameras. And you can do the same thing with video cameras if you know how to change your variables up. But that's another cinematography 2 concept. And I don't want you to worry about that right now. What I want you to do is work this basic chart and just practice making your jumps and counting your f-stops. I jumped from this to this to this, that's 2 stops. From that to that, that's 1 stop. From that to that to that to that, 3 stops. Count your jumps. Is it plus or minus exposure? Figure out what the variable has done. It's jumped this way, it went under or over. I got to jump back the other way to balance it out, so that everything balances. It's a balancing act, right? If the exposure goes up, the f-stop gets smaller, lets less light in. The ISO goes down, the aperture gets bigger, and lets more light in. But it's a balancing act. We want the f-stop that balances with the ISO, or the ND filters with the f-stop, or the NDs with the ISO, or the frames per second with the other 3 to balance out. If something changes, count the jumps that represent the change, and then create jumps on the other side that will balance it back out. Okay? That's all it is. It really is a simple concept. If you try not to think about the visuals and get consumed with, well, what am I looking at? Don't worry about what the image is. Just understand that the chart is indicating that your baseline exposure was correct. It was beautifully colored, had the right contrast and density, and it used these settings on the camera. Your baseline was this. The changes became this at this ISO when these two factors stayed the same. Your next problem is a frames per second change and an ISO change is going to equal a change in your f-stop and a change in your NDs. Count the jumps, count the jumps, count the jumps, and plug in the value from your chart. And at the end of this, I got a few questions. And you got to know by now that you can't have a project around here without answering a few questions. What have I learned? Here. 5 questions. Okay. And here they are. I want to know which of the shot solutions will produce grainy or noisy images. We talked about what creates grain and noise. Tell me which of those solutions represent grainy, noisy images. Which shot solutions make use of 2 or more layers of ND filtration? Which shot solutions will produce slow motion videography? Which shot solutions will produce fast motion videography? Slow motion and fast motion, 2 different things, they're opposites. Think about it. Which shot solutions do not make use of any ND filtration? And each of these shot solutions is numbered. Shot 1 is your baseline. Then you have an example. You have shot 2 through shot 12. Okay, that means in these boxes, you're going to give me however many shots answer this question. Which of the shot solutions will produce grainy, noisy images? Well, look for how many are using high ISOs. All right, and then put those shot numbers in this box. Okay, and do that for each of these questions. Now, I think this is a lot simpler than what you were doing before. You don't have to shoot anything. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't really even need a calculator because you've got your jump charts, and all you got to do is take your pencil and count the jumps and then work the numbers, pick the values that represent those jumps and fill in the chart and then answer the questions. Okay? You can do this at your dining room table. Probably take you, I gotta be honest, I made the chart and it took me, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. But I've been doing this a while. All right, so it's probably gonna take you an hour. Let's be realistic. It's gonna take you an hour. Okay? So plot out an hour of free time when you can sit down and do this. Give it a shot, send it in, we'll give you a new grade. Bob's your uncle. We'll move on, call it a day. All right, I hope this has been helpful. I'm going to post this video as soon as I can on the LAO so you can pull it down and take a look at it. And let me know, give me some feedback on the new assignment. Let me know if it's any better or if it's just as complicated. I don't think it is. It shouldn't be. But let me know how you feel about it. And, you know, send me an email, drop me a line, whatever. Or come to the go-to. You know, you can always come to the go-tos and get an explanation of what's going on. That's what we're here for. Okay. So that's it. Hope you have a good evening. And I'll see you around the LAO. Have a good night. And again, if you have any questions, give me a call. Email, telephone. I'll get right back with you. All right. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Have a good night.